Hello, I'm Myron Melton, and I am a school mental health and social emotional learning consultant at the Kansas State Department of Education. Today I'm going to be providing you with just a brief overview of the Kansans CAN integrated learning process. This is the state's framework for integrating social emotional learning. First, just a few learning objectives for this session. One is to explain the intentional design of the Kansans CAN integrated learning process. Second, we'll understand the major elements of the integrated learning process. And lastly, we're going to be exploring the 5 growth principles for leveraging both academic and social and emotional growth. From a policy perspective, looking at our state level work, we have had in place for some time social and emotional character development standards, our academic standards, and those things are critical to student success. But the question that we ask ourselves is, what is the process? What is the how? What allows us to connect social and emotional learning with behavior, mental health, human development, and academic achievement to get this integrated approach? In order to do that, we developed the Kansas CAN integrating learning process, which you see here. It can be a little overwhelming at first glance. There's a lot of information here, and we'll break that down into smaller chunks where it's a little easier to understand and digest. But first, I want to start with the intentionality behind the design. We were tasked with putting together the social emotional learning framework for the state. And honestly, we struggled with frameworks just a little bit. A lot of times frameworks are kind of static by nature. You know, it's more of like a picture in time. And we really felt like the social emotional development is really a process, and it's dynamic, and it's always changing, and it's relational. And we wanted to put together something that was really truly more process oriented than framework oriented. So you'll notice as you look at this framework, it's really built on 2 infinity loops, because infinity loops demonstrate that connectedness, that dynamic flow, and the idea that it's always in play. It's always in motion. So as you look at this, you'll see there's 2 distinct loops. There's an internal loop, and when I say infinity loop, think of it as kind of a sideways figure 8. There's the internal loop, where you have serve and return at the center, and you see it moves around to the left, biological, psychological, and social, and then it goes to the other side of the loop where it goes into relationships, relevance, rigor, and responsive culture. This is a part of the loop that we talk about being the what. What is it we want students to be able to learn and do? So as we look at this, the left side of that loop, where we're talking about the individual, we're talking about developing that biological and psychological and social components of the child. And in essence, that's what we all bring to the classroom. Every one of us has that makeup, that biopsychosocial makeup. So as you look at that and you look underneath those characteristics, you'll recognize some of those terms. When we talk about character development, intrapersonal skills, interpersonal skills, those are those social emotional skills we're wanting to develop. Those terms you may recognize from our social emotional character development standards. You may recognize those from the Kansas CAN competency framework. So we want to embed that language, but we're really talking about developing the social emotional side of the student. However, we know it's really important to give students the opportunity not to just learn those skills, but to practice those skills. So as you follow that infinity loop around and you come back to the right side, where we're talking about environment, we're talking about doing this in a really rich environment that's built on relationships, relevance, rigor, and responsive culture. Those 4 R words, you call them the 4 R's, you probably recognize because that's embedded in our KISA process. That's part of the school improvement process through KISA. But we start with relationships when we get to that side. That is critical. If you remember nothing else, everything that we do is in social emotional learning is based around relationships. So we really want to have those really strong relationships with kids. We want it to be relevant. I think about IPS when we talk about relevance. What is it that kids really bring to the classroom in their interests and their skills, and their curiosity and things that they want to learn about, and we tie that in with the relationships piece. Rigor is really important to this process. We want to maintain those high expectations and support them through the social emotional work. And of course, responsive culture. That's really knowing your students, knowing their needs, knowing about their families, so you can really respond to the needs of them and to the needs of your community. So when we look at this inside loop, again, we think that's the what. That's what we want kids to know and to be able to do, to learn those skills and to practice them in this really engaging classroom setting. So at this point, I'm going to have you pause the PowerPoint and reflect on or discuss the following question. How are your school's redesign efforts supporting the social and emotional development of students? And what instructional strategies are you employing that support relationships, relevance, rigor, and responsive culture? And that takes us to the next piece, and that is this outside loop that you see. So if you look at the outside, you'll see co-regulation, agency, engagement, and feedback. And we add a fifth piece to that as well. You'll notice in gray in the very center, we have a process called serve and return. Those 5 things combined, we call those the growth principles, the 5 growth principles. This is the how. This is what we think really propels this work forward. So, you start at the very center at serve and return, and we'll talk more about this, but that's really this very attuned, very attentive, adult-child relationship where it's built on give and take communication. It's built on, as I said, a real attentive type of response to the child. So that's the whole purpose behind serve and return. That's where this relationship piece starts. Then we go to the outside, and that goes into co-regulation. With that relationship, we begin to talk about how do we help that child learn to self-regulate. We know self-regulation begins to build agency. We know that agency leads to engagement, and engagement leads to feedback. Again, here are your process growth principles. This is the how. This is what we think will propel the work forward. Serve and return, co-regulation, agency, engagement, and feedback. So we start with the serve and return interaction, which we intentionally place at the center of this process. It is the core fundamental relationship piece that we built this entire process around. As we talked about earlier, relationships really is the key to this whole thing. So we define serve and return interaction as when a child serves up a bid for attention, and we respond in a connected and growth promoting way. And we know these interactions build neural pathways in the developing brain. So this is really critical. It's a critical growth component for students to have this kind of attentive and attuned relationship. Notice in the definition, we also put in parentheses spouse or colleague. This part of the developing brain goes well into adulthood. So while we're talking about our interaction between an adult and a child, it's also the interactions we have with our own peers and spouses and colleagues as well. But it's a critical piece for that brain development, we know, in the developing brain. So serve and return is this explicit interaction that takes place between the adult and the child. But we know while that's occurring, there are these implicit things that occur as well that we refer to as co-regulation. So if you look at the screen here, we would define co-regulation as when the regulated nervous system of the adult signals and implicitly assists the regulation of the student's nervous system. It creates the safety and attachment necessary for developing more explicit academic, interpersonal, and intrapersonal skills. So these seemingly small acknowledgments such as a soft tone, such as warm eye contact, such as your undivided attention, those things that we offer students, a smile, those things, while they seem simple, really develop that sense of safety, that sense of trust, that sense of attachment that allows students to develop these skills that are so critically important. I want to point out in that first bullet, because this is really a critical piece, when the self-regulated nervous system of the adult. So in order to co-regulate, it's not just that the student has to be a part of this process. It's critical that the adult bring that self-regulated self to this process as well, because that's what allows this co-regulation to take place, and it's what allows that student to feel that safety, attachment, and to begin to develop their own ability to self-regulate. So as we think about co-regulation and we think about a student's ability to learn to self-regulate, we know this is naturally going to lead to the next growth principle, which is agency. Within the integrated learning process, we define agency as being central to one's own life story, with a growing ability to make choices and decisions about one's life, to take action, and to influence one's environment. As I listen to that definition, I often think how nicely it aligns and intersects with the work that we are doing with personalized learning. This is really a critical part of this learning process, where students are starting to understand and experience student voice, how to appropriately engage in an environment, to express their needs, their desires, their choices and decisions, and having some influence over their learning environment. I also think it speaks to equity, which is critical within the social emotional learning process, where it says central to one's own life story, so that we know that when we are able to voice our needs and our choices and decisions, we can bring our whole self to that process and see ourselves reflected within the learning environment. So we know that agency and student voice and the influence that a student can have over their environment really leads to this next piece on engagement. It's going to drive that desire to be engaged in a classroom setting. We define that as a degree of connection and individual experiences in learning, doing, or interacting, implicitly demonstrated through attention, curiosity, interest, and/or passion shown or felt, explicitly demonstrated through contact, immersion, or interaction with people, materials, and/or ideas. A very rich definition for engagement. When we think about those key words, connection, interaction, passion, interest, those things that really happen in this very vibrant, engaged classroom setting. And we know they build academic skills, but they also build those relational skills, those problem-solving skills, those collaboration skills that we know are really essential as part of social emotional learning. The last growth principle we're going to talk about is feedback, and it's really critical to this process. We define feedback as an output that affects the subsequent input. It's words, actions, processes, or information that stretch us by helping us make meaning, grow in understanding, clarity, or skill, and adjust, celebrate, and/or integrate our experience. So again, a very rich definition of feedback. It's not just a grade on a paper or a % correct, but it's really taking what we've learned, reflecting on that, stretching ourselves, and having an output that's going to affect something in the future. Think about the way the growth principles are in this infinity loop. It starts with serve and return. It goes to co-regulation. We take that to agency, agency to engagement, engagement to feedback. So we're really using what we're learning to help stretch and build our understanding of agency and engagement. But then with that feedback, where do we go? The feedback on the loop takes us back to co-regulation. So when we're back to co-regulation, we're using that relationship again to discuss what went well, maybe what could have gone better. Why did you make this choice? And you begin having those conversations about the feedback that was received. that's going to affect that subsequent input. We'll then take that back into agency. We'll take that into engagement. We'll get more feedback. And this continual loop, this continual growth process remains in play. I'll have you pause your PowerPoint for a minute and reflect or discuss the following question. Which of the 5 growth principles, and remember we talked about serve and return, co-regulation, agency, engagement, and feedback, which of the 5 growth principles is your school most effective at, and which would be an area for professional growth? So as we begin to wrap up today's brief session on the Kansans CAN integrated learning process, I hope you're beginning to see this as a whole child process, that social emotional learning is not a standalone initiative. It doesn't function in isolation. Rather, it is really woven into the fabric of everything we do as a school, within our school culture, within our school climate, within our classroom instructional practices. This is always at play. We really believe that a strong social emotional foundation for students is critical for them to truly be successful and engaged in our academic environments. And we also know that what students gain in those academic environments also provides us with critical feedback to help continue to promote that social and emotional growth in all of our students. I'd like to leave you with my contact information. If at any time you have questions or you just want to visit more about this, please feel free to contact me. Here is my email and my phone number. And I wish you guys the best of luck as you're beginning your new school year, and have a great rest of your day.